If you love movies and movie discussions, you've come to the right place. Who might you ask? I am the Wiz, and I'm here today with...
Zero.
Zero, how you doing this week?
A little miserable. I basically got told that the project I'm working on in my day job, I need to throw away all the work that I've done for the last 3.5 weeks, and I've got to start over.
Ugh, that's terrible, man. God, that's fuck. You're still getting paid the same way, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still getting paid for the time I spent on the work, but yeah, just it hacked me off to hear that I'm essentially having to throw my last 3.5 weeks worth of work in the garbage.
Ah, God, that's terrible. Well, Zero, we are here to review the 1982 fantasy film Tron, starring Jeff Bridges, directed by Steve Lisberger. And I guess the one question that I really have is, have we not watched this sooner? Like, I know we joked about this last week, but I really started thinking, I was like, wait a minute, I'm not into video games as much as Zero is, but I am into video games. How did I not get into this? Or The Last Starfighter. Have you seen The Last Starfighter?
I have not. That's another one that people
Jeez.
have dropped their jaw on when I say, no, I've never seen that one. They're like, oh my God, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, like, that is a little weird. I think especially on my end, because I'm both into video games and movies, that would seem like a no-brainer. Like, you had to have seen Tron. I'm like, nope. Have you seen this 1985 German film? No? Oh, well. But yeah, so let me ask you, was there ever an interest in watching this until today?
It was always I'd get around to it. It was kind of like, oh, neat. It's kind of like a movie focused on sort of like video games becoming sort of a metaverse. Okay, neat. I would always put it off on the backlog of, I'll watch it later. I'll watch it later. And that had gone on for many years. And then finally it was like, yeah, let's put this one on the review. And I was like, my God, I'm finally watching it after these many years.
Yeah, twist my arm, Wiz. Yeah, twist my arm. So, yeah. All right, Zero. So let's get into the review of Tron, directed by Steve Lisberger. Before that, let's get into the plot. When talented computer engineer Kevin Flynn, played by Jeff Bridges, finds out that Ed Dillinger, played by Dave Warner, an executive at his company, has been stealing his work, he tries to hack the system. However, Flynn is transported into a digital world where he has to face off against Dillinger's computerized likeness, Sark, and the imposing Master Control program. Zero, I'm going to let you start here because I'm very curious as to what you thought about this film.
It was actually kind of fun. Actually kind of harkened back to a period when Disney's films were just so much more experimental and so much more interesting, which is really sad because there hasn't been a lot from Disney lately that has interested me. So it was kind of interesting sort of stepping back in time and going, oh man, this was when Disney was daring and willing to kind of take a jump on interesting things with interesting narratives and also using cutting edge CG technology. Okay, this is kind of an interesting movie on a historical end, but as the movie went through, it was an entertaining movie, especially with a sort of like, I guess, conceptualizing video game and computer program related concepts into sort of a interesting contextual way that relates to the digital world inside the computer system that the MCP dominates.
Let me ask you a question, though. Would this be something that you would have an adult who's never watched this movie recommend to? Would you recommend this to an adult?
Personally, I would.
Really?
Mostly because I think it's fun and it isn't like super hyper nerdy that you have to be really clued into either video games or internet technologies or work in either industry to really get. It makes things interesting, but it doesn't get too much into the geek speak.
Well, yeah, that is true. It doesn't get too esoteric with the terminology, or you don't have to really know what's going on with how games are made in order to enjoy the movie. That is true. But I think this is meant to be a family picture of sorts. I think this is really meant for people who are nostalgic for video games of that era, which is, I think, arcade games from the 70s and 80s, or like Atari games to a certain extent.
Yeah, it's definitely something that has the context of early Atari games. And I think when I was doing some supplemental research on this, apparently Lisberger was just absolutely fascinated with video games in general after he saw Pong. That sort of was the catalyst that basically ended up inspiring him to write out this movie. And there's definitely a very, very, very heavy-handed influence of games from the Atari era. I think it's kind of nice for that. It gives a jumping off point for anyone who may have originally grown up during the era. I know a lot of millennials didn't really grow up with Atari, so in some cases the reference may be lost on them. Even when we get into some of the later generations of adults and things like that they may not understand the context. Unfortunately, it may be lost on them, but maybe they did have a huge fascination in games, and maybe they looked at some of the Atari stuff, so there could still be a relevancy point there. But yeah, overall, I thought it was neat just kind of seeing the relevancy and sort of tie into the Atari era video games, that this does still feel like a family film. I don't think it's bad for that. I think it just harkens back to an era when Disney was great at making family films that could be enjoyed by just all ages in the family. It wasn't just like, oh, this is so childish. Oh, geez, I'm having to sit through this movie with my kids, or the opposite way around where the kids are going, oh, God, this is so boring. Yeah. I hate this grown-up movie. It kind of strikes that fine balance of being great with both. It's just something that just harkens back to an older era of Disney.
My only issue with recommending this to either adults or kids is that with kids today, would they look at this and go, what the hell is this shit? It's like, look at the graphics and look at the way it looks. Goes, oh, this is ugly looking. This is a really hard movie to recommend, honestly, because I don't know who to recommend it to other than people who are nostalgic for that type of game. There's also a thing that I want to recognize, though, is that the movie has a very unique look to it. Just the way that the film looks inside the game, I think, is just very interesting to watch, especially with how they render the faces. How they make the faces look and the rest of the world look. Like how everything is colorful in the background, and yet the faces are gray and lifeless and lack any kind of color to it. I thought that was a very interesting look.
I thought it sort of gave the feel of the old black and white TV console games when they were connected through the RF connector. How they had sort of a light bit of static fuzz. I was just like, oh man, I still remember when you had to connect consoles to the RF line of a TV. My God, those were the days.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I never really thought about that. I enjoyed my time watching Tron, but if I'm being honest, I think there are a number of problems with the film that I had that, which I would hold back on giving a hard recommendation on. I would recommend it to like a certain group of people, which we've just mentioned, but I think overall, if I had like my nephews over or if I had kids over, I would not be recommending Tron to them. Even though they play video games, I don't think I'd be recommending this to them.
This would be a much easier recommendation to people who have grown up with video games in their lives, because I think this would be a fairly entertaining movie.
Yeah.
But if it's somebody who either has had no interest in video games or just thinks video games are just childish things, then this would probably be one that I would just say, all right, never mind, I can't recommend this to you.
Yeah. This is very limited to where we would recommend this to somebody. So I think that's one issue there. So, all right, Zero. So here are the footnotes for Tron. I have one. I know you mentioned a bunch of ancillary stuff during your review, but I have one that I wanted to section off. Is this movie the reason why FMV games in the 90s look this way? I'm not making a joke here, because I think that's actually pretty cool. That's the first thing that I thought about when I watched this. I was like, wow, this looks like Sewer Shark or any of those other FMV games from the 90s. And I thought, wow, that's actually kind of cool. Like, I thought that was cool. It's kind of lame for the 90s FMV games, but I think it actually works in this movie. That's the very first thing I thought about.
I think FMV movies really took off during the CD era, because the Sega CD really went heavy into the FMV heavy sort of games like Sewer Shark, Night Trap, and so on and so forth. And since this was done in 82, this was much before that. It kind of relevant to the point. I had read an interesting piece of trivia. Apparently, John Lasseter, same John Lasseter behind Toy Story, was apparently enamored with this film when he had first saw it. It was kind of the catalyst for John Lasseter to look at CG animation. That was pretty much the catalyst that ended up getting Pixar off the ground. Yeah. So essentially, if Tron never was created and John Lasseter never got to see it, you would not have any of the Pixar movies.
All right, Zero. So do you recommend the 1982 film Tron?
Yeah, I definitely would. Mostly because I felt it was an entertaining movie. It's a little bit more entertaining if you've got the perspective of playing video games in your life, or you work in the IT industry, or both. That's where just it becomes much more entertaining. It doesn't get too in the weeds with the computer and video game jargon, which I think is to its benefit, because sometimes when some movies or animations just kind of get lost in their own world building, it can be a little bit much to absorb. So I think condensing things down to be nice and succinct was a very good design decision for the movie. The special effects for the in-game universe are very interesting. It evokes the feel of an old video game, especially with the mention that we had earlier, where the faces kind of seemed like they had some static in them. And it kind of gives the feeling of playing an old video game that was connected to a TV via the RF line and everything. Overall, I would definitely recommend it.
So I have been going back and forth in my head. Like, before we started the review, I was going to recommend it. Then as I started thinking about what we're doing the review, I was like, nah, I can't recommend it. I'm going to go back and say I will recommend it, but like I think you've mentioned and like we mentioned in the review, this is a very limited recommendation. This is like for specific people who are into this type of thing and can appreciate what the film is going for. I think you mentioned as well, if you're not into video games, don't bother. Now, I would also say, if you have no interest in games of the past, don't bother. That's really my one issue with this. Like, I think you would really need to have that kind of fascination or that attachment to games in order to actually enjoy this. I think, honestly, this is meant for kids. It's really hard for me to recommend this for adults, though, so that's kind of another issue that I have, really. Like, I don't think I could actually recommend this to an adult unless I know that they are into video games in a big way. And even for, like, kids, unless I'm going to be like, oh, there's this weird kind of thing, and maybe they're into it, then fine. But it's not a bad movie. It's just not that interesting to me in the end. Like, after I watched it, I was like, yeah, okay, that's fine. That's cool. I don't feel the need to watch Tron Legacy or to play the numerous games based on Tron after watching it. I don't think it's a bad movie. Do you feel like you want to get to know more of the Tron stuff? Do you want to see the other movie? Do you want to play the games?
I think the games that came out during the era when movie tie-in games were pretty terrible.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think I'd be making my way out to play any of the games, but the movie, I'm not so sure I'd go out of my way to go see it. It might be something that, you know, if someone has it kind of playing at their house for like background noise, I might kind of peek over and go, oh shit, that's Tron Legacy. It's not something that I'm just going to actively go, out of my way, jerkwads, I'm watching this.
All right, Zero, so do you recommend Tron?
Yes, I do.
And I also recommend Tron. So check that out on Disney Plus, or if you want to rent it for $4, you can as well. Now, if you want my full review on this movie, you can go to my website at iamthewiz.com. You'll have my full written review right on the site, along with a link to the video that has this review that you've just listened to. Thank you for listening to this review. If you want to know what we're reviewing in the next couple days, you can look on the screen right now to see what's coming up next. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and leave a like on this video. If you want to discuss your opinion on the film or the review itself, please leave a comment. And if you want to hear more, subscribe to the channel. Thank you again for listening. I will talk to you next time.